Neon Night Forever, Continued. Part 2, Section 2. Tim Burton's Noirmare Before Christmas versus Joel Schumacher's Camp Noir, embracing a living comic book as a visual thriller. If there is one specific scene that has Joel Schumacher's Batman written in screaming capitals all over it and reveals him as an intruder, given the previous iterations of Batman and the Hollywood blockbuster formula, it has to be the final shot of Batman Forever, repeated later in the ending of Batman and Robin, which shows the main protagonists running towards the camera against the background of the sharply illuminated bat signal, to the accompaniment of Elliot Goldenthal's upbeat march. That single shot alone could be used as an eloquent representation of Schumacher's fundamental aesthetic choice for his Batman, a hybrid camp noir style, as contrasted with what Tim Burton had opted for. The latter's more reasonable and artistically acceptable fusion of noir elements and expressionistic imagery had already been in evidence in the classic German expressionist cinema of the 1920s and 30s, in its American variety of equally classic Universal Studios horror, and in the monster fests from the British Hammer Studios in which Burton himself was so invested. Before discussing Schumacher's camp noir aesthetic, which lent his night to the final neon look, one cannot fail to consider Burton's last Batman work, the 1992 sequel to his commercial juggernaut of 1989, which nevertheless had met with a peculiar reception, as the concerned public found it too much of a Burton film rather than a Batman film. As inevitable as the idea of a sequel to the 1989 Batman was to everybody after the movie's phenomenal theatrical run, with approximately $412 million in worldwide revenue, it so happened that the most crucial person in the entire project, Tim Burton himself, was not particularly convinced that a follow-up to the character's arc was necessary. As numerous sources have reported over the years, the production of Batman was so stressful and so consuming for the young creator that for a time he simply did not see any point in carrying on with the job. Of all involved, Burton himself was probably the most unhappy with how the first film finally turned out. As Mark S. Reinhardt recalls, the bosses at the Warner Brothers studio were so determined to sign Burton on again, as he had now become a fully fledged author following public acclaim for Batman's original noir style, that they decided to lure the director by giving him free rein to do things his way that time. According to Reinhardt, quote, Warner Brothers was able to heighten Burton's interest in directing the Batman sequel by giving him far more creative control over the film that he was allowed to have over Batman. For the Batman sequel, he would be both producer and director, end quote. In time, however, the profound confidence the studio had in making Batman 2 as a Tim Burton movie in every respect eventually proved its handicap, just as Burtonism had been considered the greatest advantage of the 1989 release and the reason for its appreciation. With regard to the divisive reception of the second installment, Glenn Weldon rightly observes, quote, Batman Returns was destined to become what it ultimately turned out to be, un film de Tim Burton, with Batman in it. As the story of the two Batmen by Tim Burton has already been recounted in detail in many insightful monographs over the years, this section will focus mainly on the qualities of Burton's second take on the character, as well as consider its financial and artistic impact, which resulted in bringing in Joel Schumacher as a replacement for Burton in June 1993. Concerning the prospective sequel, Burton was interested in the opportunity offered by Warner Brothers Studios, whereby they wanted to do things differently this time and strictly follow the director's wishes. Unlike with the first film, when Burton was just a young creative thrown into a tangle of visions of the producers, merchandisers, as well as other members of film's creative team. Significantly enough, Burton made a profound statement in the production to the official Batman Returns official movie book edited by Michael Singer. Quote, So let me begin by just saying that Batman Returns is not really a sequel to Batman. It doesn't pick up where the first film left off. The sets for Gotham City are completely new. There are lots of new elements in the visuals and storyline that haven't been seen before. Even Batman's costume has been revised. The point was to make it all feel fresh and new. It was the only way I could envision the movie. End quote. It would not be unreasonable to see the 1989 Batman and the 1992 Batman Returns as separate projects, although they do share common yet occasionally very sketchy cinematic continuity and general tone of story. However, the substantial changes introduced by the sequel suffice to set it apart from the previous installment. As the aforementioned Glenn Weldon noted, Batman Returns is a strictly authorial project with all the necessary ingredients of cinematic Burtonism, with the main character adjusted to dovetail with that artistic and thematic environment, rather than the other way around. Ironically, this was the primary reason behind the earlier success. After all, the Batman persona as defined by Burton fitted perfectly into the gallery of Burton-esque characters such as Edward Scissorhands, Jack Skellington, Ed Wood, and Willy Wonka. Misunderstood, eccentric, introverted, and socially awkward geniuses that echoed Burton's own interest in all kind of misfits, whom the world considered monsters. The amplified Burtonism in Batman Returns resulted in a much more confusing final outcome. Since the film happened to be far keener on showcasing monstrous wretches, notably Danny DeVito's hideous Penguin and Michelle Pfeiffer's alluring Catwoman, than a traditional superhero flick, while its interest in the main protagonist was also very limited. Weldon concludes, Batman Returns exudes every stylized, quintessentially Burton-esque artisanal quirk in the toolbox, except the sense of melancholy. Without it, the film powers through the confusing switchbacks of its plot, cynically risking nothing, and about nothing except itself. As the quintessential Tim Burton film with Batman in it, Batman Returns is in some ways more an artistic and spiritual derivative of Burton's later animated The Nightmare Before Christmas than a descendant of the original Batman from 1989. Its final form and atmosphere could be encapsulated as a noir-mare before Christmas story that tries to combine the previous Batman's noir roots with a much more gruesome aspect and a tinge of Christmas mood, so meaningful for many films by Burton. As a result, the 1992 feature certainly disappointed some of the expectations aroused by the 1989 blockbuster, namely that it would deliver a much more personal or even strictly artistic touch than the full-blown spectacle of 3 years prior. Still, there are several elements of note here that directly anticipate Joel Schumacher's reinterpretation of the franchise in 1995. The first is the depiction of the main superhero who, as previously observed, was clearly conceived as yet another entry in the gallery of Burton's rejects. For many years, one of the fundamental issues the fans and critics had with Batman Returns was evident lack of interest in the noir-mare knight on Burton's part. The director himself admitted on multiple occasions that this was precisely how, in his opinion, a Batman-focused story should be told. The series of Tim Burton interviews, edited by Christian Fraga, includes a conversation between the director and Mark Shapiro concerning that reluctant portrayal of the comic book good doer, in which the following is disclosed, quote, "We chose not to try and uncover any more skeletons about this guy. Batman has always been a tricky character because, by his nature, he wants to remain in the shadows. He's a tough character because he's so internalized." End quote. It may seem to be a direct response to the general concerns regarding Batman's characteristics, i.e. those of an emotionally inaccessible Avenger, but it is particularly interesting that the fans criticized Batman Returns for being more of a Burton Man Returns narrative. This is profoundly and quite symbolically evinced in Mark S. Reinhardt's Batman filmography, where the author openly expresses his own disappointment as a fan with the exceedingly personal depiction of his favorite character. Quote, "From this Batman fan's perspective, Tim Burton must be held accountable for most all of Batman Returns' failings. In the film, he chose to depict Batman, Penguin, and Catwoman in ways that made them almost unrecognizable so that they reflect his own morose sensibilities. They are not so much Batman characters in the film as they are Burton characters. Simply put, Batman Returns isn't about Batman. It is about Burton's perception of modern urban life as a lonely, hopeless existence. If Burton wanted to make a film with this particular message, he should have made it using characters of his own invention." End quote. Burton's far-reaching retelling in his second endeavor with Batman's lore engendered somewhat unexpected responses from the studio and the audience, who experienced Batman Returns in the regular setting of blockbuster entertainment as a subversive act of being shown an art-oriented, rather than franchise-oriented film. Quote, "Critics seemed to be amused by the idea that people were going to see Batman Returns hoping for an action-packed good time, and would instead be walloped over the head by Burton's morose, edgy art film." End quote. Indeed, the 1992 motion picture had been designed as a virtually anti-franchise production, both thematically and commercially. Seeing that, quote, While the commonly accepted arc for Batman movies sees him leaving the shadows and learning the basic benefits of teamwork, Returns seems like a step back from the traditions of his story's progression. Burton and his collaborators obviously don't much believe in the efficacy of Batman's heroism, a step away from the majestic end of the first film, which has Batman being tacitly deputized via the shining glow of the bat signal. The Batman of Returns always seems to be working through something. His escapades don't feel like daring-do attempts to rid the city of the evil that stole his parents, nor do they ever unfold in that direction, like we see in The Batman. They're more like pressure valve releases for a disturbed individual." End quote. It was apparently the anti-franchise formula used by Burton that had the most impact on the decision to have the director replaced. Once again, the accompanying debate about the backlash from American parents concerned about the grotesque mood of Batman Returns became almost a meme in today's terms, with a number of televised reports from 1992 widely available now through streaming services. Ironically enough, the artistic mandate that Warner Bros. Gave Burton at the beginning of production brought about the inevitable consequence of such a strategy. A highly unconventional attempt to deliver a challenging movie as opposed to a bland gadget generator. In a documentary about the origins of Batman Returns, Sam Hamm, the co-author of the 1989 Batman screenplay, commented, "The movie itself was never presented as, as a child-friendly movie." And the film's chief screenwriter, Daniel Waters, admittedly likewise, quote, "I've seen the movie with audiences much more than Tim has. I actually go to a lot of theaters, and it was always great. The lights coming up after Batman Returns, and it was like kids crying and people acting like they were punched in the stomach, like they've been mugged. The part of me was like, oops." Batman Returns is an intriguing case of what is clearly an anti-franchise approach, clashing with a franchise-focused perception. The film did manage to market a vast range of Batman-related memorabilia, but it was the overall response from the parents of young viewers that eventually prompted hysteria around the release. In one of the most memorable U.S. television reports on the unwelcoming showing of Batman Returns from July 1982, one of the guests, a child critic, he was 10 years old at the time, Danny Slosky, stated that it was a total attack against kids, the whole movie. Everything that kids love was being used against them. The same sentiment was expressed sometime later by a guest on the show, allegedly a concerned mother of a young girl. I do think the marketing confused us a little, and a lot of the reason that we went to see it was based on what my memories of Batman were from when I was a child. The whole series of comic books that were very, very defined, good versus evil. It was not a real violence, rather inferred violence, and it was justice and morality. The common denominator here is the fundamental allegation that Burton failed to respect the conventional expectations of Batman's appearance, which, as Slosky argued, was anything but child-friendly entertainment. Curiously enough, the 1989 iteration of Batman could have hardly been defined as a movie appropriate for children. With its explicit depictions of Jack Nicholson's Joker's violent acts, though the main reason behind the more widespread approval may have been that the heroes and villains in the 1989 Batman were fairly unambiguous, and the aforementioned opposition of good versus evil was clear. In the more Burton-centric Batman Returns, the structure of this classical conflict is rendered more complex. With the lackluster figure of Batman, the center of gravity shifts towards the outrageously aggressive performances of DeVito and Pfeiffer, epitomizing Burton's tortured soul. The misfits who, having been rejected by society, adopt more brutal modes of action. Catwoman's main narrative premise is taking revenge on her former boss, while Penguin's biblical plan to kill all of Gotham City's firstborns is a call for twisted justice rooted in his own Moses-like fate. Undoubtedly, both villains are figures of the Burton-esque persuasion, giving their ambiguous motives and disputable behavior, rather than comic book faithful interpretations of a cat burglar and a greedy, bird-themed thief. That must have been a major factor compounding the confusion of probably the most crucial audience of the Batman sequel, namely the licensees. Tim Burton himself recalls in a somewhat funny vein, "I think I upset McDonald's. They asked, 'What's that black stuff coming out of the Penguin's mouth? We can't sell Happy Meals with that.'" The involvement of merchandise-focused enterprises such as McDonald's or Kenner at an early stage in the Batman Returns production was also reflected in the extensive material and publications concerning the film, which referred to Burton's general loathing of filmmaking that prioritized merchandise. The absurdity of such an approach was even more obvious considering that, as noted previously, the entire film crew were well aware at the outset that this particular production would be more director than commercially driven. The striking contrast between the colorful action figures and Happy Meal toys on the one hand, and the gritty tone and unsettling imagery on the other, was highlighted by Mark S. Reinhardt, who stated that, quote, all of their efforts to market the film would be construed as a cynical effort to entice young children to see a movie that they really had no business seeing. End quote. Paradoxically, what was unintentionally a family film intentionally relied on Burton's taste and artistic preferences. If 1989 gave the world a Batman made by Tim Burton, the year 1992 offered it a Burton Man based on Batman iconography. Consequently, neither the fans, the executives, the critics, nor the family audience were satisfied. Still, with Burton's contribution made extreme, yet another denizen of Batman's artistic multiverse emerges. A noir-mare knight born out of the fascinating combination of Burton's Christmas horror, the noir leftovers from his previous work, and a trio of the sinister yet internally tragic characters. At present, acclaim for the film is growing among fans, but it was clear at the time that a correction course was needed. The goal was to extricate the Dark Knight from his noir-mare embodiment, revive public interest in the franchise, and regain the trust of Batman's most essential audience. The task was entrusted to Joel Schumacher, but even though he managed to breathe life into the franchise, which yielded renewed box office and merchandise revenue, Warner Bros. Studios once again got something they had probably wanted to avoid. Another excessively individual vision which alienated many of the conservative Batman consumers. Recently, Michael Keaton, the on-screen Batman in the two Burton movies, reminisced on his meeting with Joel Schumacher. I remember one of the things that I walked away going, oh boy, I can't do this. He asked me, I don't understand why everything has to be so dark and everything's so sad. And I went, oh, wait a minute. Do you know how this guy got to be Batman? Have you read? I mean, it's pretty simple. Right there at the very outset, the most significant attribute of Schumacher's vision of Batman becomes clear. The undarkening process so unimaginable for the majority of Batman fans. And yet, is it such a travesty to even envisage that kind of Batman's appearance? As already stated, Schumacher's idea for Batman, embodied in the Neon Knight, was based on three distinct yet complementary predecessors who had already radically redefined the Dark Knight into much brighter iterations of the character. What if the apparently novel variant created by Schumacher is just another form of hybridization? As the director succeeded in merging the Camp Knight, the Dad Knight, and the Cute Knight, blended in a soupcon of Noir-Mare Knight from Burton's duology, to ultimately arrive at the Camp Noir style as seen in Batman Forever and Batman and Robin. To appreciate the nuances of the Neon Knight as he turned out, the first thing is to comprehend Schumacher's visual conception for Batman, which attempted to combine highly cartoony and campy influences with the post-Burton-esque neo-Gothic and noir imagery. Commonly in Batman's legacy, the two duologies of Burtonverse and Schumacherverse are often approached as complementary to each other in narrative and aesthetic terms, though Schumacher is treated as a tonally disturbing supplement to the previously established post-expressionistic agenda of Burton's. According to Ben Aldis, quote, the most glaring difference would be the visuals. Gotham City seemingly regenerated overnight, becoming a garish and cartoony town with no sign of the original quasi-40s noir world. Dialogue and characters are also light-hearted and overblown. Villains like Arnold Schwarzenegger's Mr. Freeze or Jim Carrey's The Riddler acted more silly than sinister, and boasted nonsensical schemes of world domination. Humor was less organic and more campy and on the nose, which unfortunately undercut attempts at drama, i.e. Alfred lying on his deathbed. Perhaps most jarringly, though, Batman inexplicably forgets his reputation as shadowy vigilante by appearing at jungle parties. End quote. Clearly, Schumacher is not merely emulating Burton's visual paradigm for Batman's mythology, but rather elaborating on it, adding another somewhat unlooked-for ingredient, a more comedic, campy, and non-serious overtone, which is even more robust than Burton's grotesque depiction of Joker in 1989. This process of lightening the structures that Burton drenched in the noirish shadows started precisely with the 1995 Batman Forever, perfectly epitomizing that new camp noir aesthetic, which sought to balance the campy, the cartoony, and the recent expressionistic iterations into one genuinely explosive artistic mix. Schumacher himself admitted openly in Michael Singer's Batman Forever, the official movie book, "I think Tim did a wonderful job with the other movies, but to copy someone isn't really to flatter them. I think it was incumbent upon us to give our own version of the Batman legend, trying to incorporate some of the things Tim started, but also to give it a new, never-before-seen look." Singer adds later, quote, "The goal was to bring audiences a new concept of the Batman myth, shimmering with color, shadow, light, and movement." End quote. If one were trying to find an apposite description of the camp noir scheme conceived by Joel Schumacher for his Batman duology, there is yet another term frequently highlighted by the director and numerous observers over the years: the living comic book experience. It follows the interpretations or intuitions of the film crew members, as most of them mention similar events which produce the living comic book in which Schumacher was interested. According to Janet and Lee Batchelor, the screenwriters for Batman Forever, some of the fundamentals in Schumacher's mode of filmmaking were his obsession with color enhancement and the tenet of lots of colors, lots of movement, which would make it possible to achieve comic book quality in a cinematic feature. And yet another insight, this time from Vanille, a makeup artist on Forever, Schumacher's own flamboyant presence was a key and potent factor, causing the film to be more light-hearted and very colorful, very upbeat, and very broad. One of the most crucial members of the crew, production designer Barbara Ling, added to the final style along these lines, quote, "The idea, too, is that you're staying with mainly night, so neon becomes a very important element. And creating many influences of neon, the beautiful neon signs of the 20s and 30s, that would have really taken you the look that you see kind of a 42nd Street in old black and white photographs to what Tokyo has now, which is wild graphics on giant proportions." End quote. The graphicness of those living comic books that both Schumacher's Batman are was apparently explicitly demanded daily on the set. Nicole Kidman mentions heightened reality, a byword commonly heard whilst filming Batman Forever, and Barbara Ling corroborates that striving for the comic book feel, quote, "We were very influenced by the comics, which always had these wonderful color washes in the frames. In one panel, the wash would be red, and in the next scene, blue. That was very striking to us, and we felt that it was an important element to capture." End quote. In fact, multiple catchphrases describing the Schumacher look are cited, including post-apocalyptic expressionism, giant graphic elements of graffiti, but all done in ultraviolet paint lit with incandescent lights, visuals in the vein of Frankenstein meets Las Vegas, and psycho-disco flavor. Finally, Michael Goff, who played the faithful butler Alfred, should perhaps be credited with the most accurate characterization of that living comic book approach as an expansion of Burton's former artistic mannerisms. Quote, "Tim was more of a psychological thriller, and Joel is more a viewing thriller, an excitement to look at." End quote. Akiva Goldsman endorses this notion, commenting that Joel's style is very presentational and operatic. This visual thriller built around vibrant colors magnified by blasts of neon light, set in a post-apocalyptic, expressionist landscape featuring oversized gargoyles and crooked alleyways winding between enormous skyscrapers, translates into a genuine attempt at finding balance between the graphic absurdity deriving from camp imagery and the essential post-Burtonism with its taste for gothicized spaces. This visual thriller built around vibrant colors magnified by blasts of neon light, set in a post-apocalyptic expressionist landscape, featured oversized gargoyles and crooked alleyways winding between enormous skyscrapers, translates into a genuine attempt at finding balance between the graphic absurdity deriving from camp imagery and the essential post-Burtonism with its taste for gothicized spaces. Mark S. Reinhardt concludes that it ultimately brought about a complete divorce from reality due to its overwhelming penchant for outrageously garish shades of magenta, orange, and lime green. These colors did not seem to match up with the images of the dark, shadow-lined streets of Gotham City. Batman Forever's cinematographer Stephen Goldblatt noticed that the particular palette was anything but random. Quote, "Batman's are blues and purples and whites. Two-Face is red and magenta. The Riddler is green. It really bangs out, and that's great about them. We're not trying to be subtle. I really liked it when Joel said from the beginning that he wanted the film to be operatic." End quote. The fundamental problem lies in the very notion of Batman's accurate depiction. Should it lean substantially towards The Dark Knight, or be more inclusive and embrace the neon-lit, brighter presence that Schumacher wanted to bring to the fore? Thus, the real question is whether Schumacher achieved that overall comic book quality as he had intended, and also how could one appreciate his effort as a valuable feat of adapting the graphic exploits of cartoony superheroes. Despite Reinhardt's reluctance towards Schumacher's attempt to undarken The Dark Knight, which apparently failed due to poor choice of colors, other commentators underscore the different aesthetic yield that came with the director's effort to overcome the black-hued practical realism of Batman's character and environment. In Kimberly Ann Auscherke's dissertation, in which she studied the Batman franchise in the light of modern conglomerate filmmaking, Schumacher's work is described as exaggeration-focused, as the duology attempts to mirror the director's taste for multi-layered excess and the ecstatic portrayals of the protagonists and similarly overblown visuals, which make it a quote-unquote Saturday Night Fever on acid. As a result, both Schumacher films evince the living comic book on screen approach, in which artistic overstatement is the prevalent factor. The colors are bedazzling, the movements and gestures of the characters theatrical, the camera angles are crooked, and the set designs declare that nothing here is a normal world, from the very opening seconds. In other words, Schumacher's formula for achieving this living comic book experience in a motion picture is to follow a slightly altered definition of the graphic medium introduced by Scott McCloud. While in McCloud's Understanding Comics, comic bookness may result from a strategy involving amplification through simplification, Schumacher's living comic bookness is obtained by amplification through exaggeration, where every diegetic and non-diegetic element has to verge on invasive in its impact on the viewer's perception. Finally, the neon attribute defining Schumacher's Knight can be presumed to reflect the deliberate decision to take the Batman character out of his regular shadows and place him right in the center of this over-orchestrated and over-designed setting so as to trespass this particular artistic taboo and create a Batman who can abandon his metaphorical dark cave both visually and tonally. To be fair, Schumacher's Batman are hardly the first to have attempted such an aggressive redrawing of a comic book in a feature film. The 1990s had none of the CGI which is widely used today to lend comic book quality to a motion picture, in adaptations such as Zack Snyder's 300 or Edgar Wright's Scott Pilgrim vs. the World. Still, a number of interesting productions actively pursued what Drew Jeffries calls expressive intermediality, meaning the presence of conventions associated with comics, both visual and narrative, and achieved an original form of stylistic remediation of the comic book into film, also referred to as transmedia style by, for instance, Drew Morton. Schumacher films about Batman surely belong among those early efforts to find such a transmedia aesthetic, asserting directly that the world presented on screen has no interest in any sort of psychological or artistic toning down of the inherent preference of comic books to amplify meanings or messages by simplifying them. Although with Schumacher, both the meanings and messages in his Batman flicks are simplified yet exaggerated by a never-ending march of vivid images and unsophisticated emotional cadence. An attempt akin to Schumacher's living comic book project may be found in another often disregarded comic book film of the 1990s, namely Warren Beatty's Dick Tracy from 1990, which shares many groundbreaking concepts of how to show a comic book on the screen with the later neon Batman releases. The aesthetic aspect of Dick Tracy was comprehensively discussed by Michael Cohen in a detailed study of the 1990s cinematic Underdog, in which the author made a number of worthwhile observations concerning Beatty's ideas for animating comic book panels. Regarding the most crucial artistic tools employed in that intriguing feature, Cohen uses the term the aesthetic of artifice to describe the film's expressive comic book-based intermediality whose main premise is to refuse to let the spectator forget this film is based on a comic. A strategy of cartooning and Dick tracing makes the choreography of character actions and behaviors implausible and complements the aesthetic of artifice in the production design. Plus, multiple cinematic techniques were used to underscore the artifice. 1. Impracticality of the props. elaborate prosthetics of the characters, and cartoon-like makeup. 2. Affected poses commonly assumed by characters. 3. Blatant artificiality of set designs with theatrical lighting. 4. Extensive application of consciously uncinematic production and post-production methods, such as speeding up character movement during fight scenes, frequent use of intra-frame editing instead of the more acceptable and genre-accurate interframe method, and finally, 5. The now virtually iconic use of a diopter lens capable of providing a sharp focus on both the foreground and background elements to sustain the impression of seeing a single comic book frame on the screen. Cohen concludes his analysis by recognizing Dick Tracy to have been the result of simplification through amplification filmmaking rooted in comics, an unconventional comic book adaptation which strove to find a way to transmediation. Dick Tracy's aesthetic of artifice was indeed implemented in Joel Schumacher's living comic book project, since a number of Beattie's tricks may be seen in the Neon Batman as well. One of the most significant elements is the overall impracticality of Schumacher's visions. Both Batman Forever and Batman and Robin open with elaborate scenes portraying the protagonists as they set out to fight evil. There is a long focus on the neon-lit Batmobile slowly coming up through the Batcave's floor. Just to stand there for a minute in a glamorous shot is nothing more than a celebration of the image, a moment for the viewer to feast their eyes on the shiny, sinuous surface of a car. Similarly, the over-the-top costumes and gadgets of the superheroes, which Schumacher films are also notorious for, inclusive of the infamous white-themed snow costumes from Batman and Robin's final fight with Arnold Schwarzenegger's Mr. Freeze, exploit the look-over-use approach which aims to ensure visual thrill, as a visual thriller should, where watching a prop makes more sense than having it slowly introduced and explained. Schumacher's Batman films also boast makeup and costume design exaggerations, the most conspicuous of which is the pink facial burn prosthetic of Tommy Lee Jones's Two-Face and the LED illuminated outfit of Mr. Freeze, which would have been pointless in practically oriented storytelling, but do well in the artifice-centered agenda of the living comic book. Other noteworthy elements include the theatrical and highly contrived poses of Schumacher's heroes and villains, indicative of an obvious effort to obtain shots that make one think of a cartoon rather than reality. The impressive entrance of Val Kilmer's Batman in Batman Forever in the first few minutes shows the Neon Knight swirling on his bat rope down the street, his cape majestically floating back, whereas in the film's big highlight, Batman intervenes at the neon-filled party hijacked by Two-Face, slowly falling down through a skylight in a shot celebrating the essence of the bat-like figure, which descends in a slowed visual composition that lasts a good few seconds. The even more absurd scenes in Schumacher's duology, such as George Clooney's Batman swishing his cape to reveal the prostrate form of Mr. Freeze, prioritize the look of almost immobilized characters as in the comic book frame, rather than continuing the cinematic movement of the preceding dynamic chase sequence. The final view of Gotham City, an urban space dominated by unbelievable overgrown gargoyles and Greek-like male statues, neon-sprayed alleys and street corners, the thoroughly abstract locations and cartoonish landscapes, like the Riddler's lair built to resemble his brain-draining invention called the Box, or the local observatory shaped like a giant statue holding the telescope dome, in no way depict any practical structure. All such sets and places follow the doctrine of artifice, creating spaces that offer an exciting backdrop to equally nonsensical motions and actions of the protagonists, in which looks trump making sense. This is splendidly illustrated by Robin's visually compelling entrance during the initial museum showdown with Mr. Freeze, where the young hero's motorcycle crashes through the door leaving Robin's emblem-shaped hole. There is no other point to it other than delivering yet another visual thrill. Schumacher's Neon Knight lives in this strange realm of absurd geography, surrounded by blinding colors and lights, cartoonish behavior, and avails himself of a constantly growing number of gadgets and vehicles, far in excess of a respected Dark Knight persona. Still, does this overhaul of Batman's mythology really damage the visual integrity of the character too much? Is it indeed embarrassing to see a Batman who inhabits a land of unpractical yet visually compelling and teeming locations, in which he is presented as a mythical figure with all the awe-inspiring trappings of a superhero, as opposed to an urban law enforcer? The thing is that even despite the general disapproval arising from the thematic aftermath of the Neon Night, which will be covered later, Schumacher's living comic book drew a striking dividing line between the viewers who pleaded for a mature, less operatic and cartoony Batman story, and the viewers who were genuinely amazed by the unique ability of those films to make every single image exciting. Just as Tegan O'Neill advised, quote, "Please, do not take my word for it. Just watch it. Turn the volume off if you need. Look at the color. Lean into the Baroque excess. Enjoy the scenery being chewed like the crew refused to feed the actors and hid sandwiches in the wall. The cinematography. Every inch of every frame has been composed almost to obsequiousness. It is frankly a marvel. It anticipates every excess of the digital color era." End quote. The fact is that for Schumacher, each and every shot should be exaggerated, and each and every scene should ensure a blood-pumping transition to another highly energized shot or scene. Schumacher appears to be overly dramatic and representation-focused, as Akiva Goldsman noted, but he is very consistent in this type of dramatic cartoon filmmaking. Take, for instance, Bruce Wayne's somewhat abrupt entry into Dr. Chase Meridian's office as they meet for the first time in Batman Forever. The scene starts with a classic shot of Wayne walking down the hallway with the camera slowly shifting to Dutch angle, while shrill screaming of a woman is heard. A quick succession of shots showing Wayne struggling with the doors to Meridian's office, with Dutch angle throughout, ends with him breaking through the obstacle just to see the doctor, all safe and sound, exercising with a punching bag, while the composition of the scene reverts from Dutch angle as if the crooked, heroic persona of Wayne in action were coming back to a more straight public presence. The living comic book adopted by Schumacher translates into an almost thoroughly immersive cinema experience, in which there is no particular interest in cultivating the substance of the story, but extensive effort goes into enhancing the audio and visual ingredients of cinema. In addition to the visuals, an essential role belongs to Elliot Goldenthal's equally operatic score and the simplified through exaggeration manner of composition. The music written for both Schumacher films fluctuates constantly between the experimental and absurdly atonal compositions like Nigma Variations, an ode to science, from Batman Forever, to the more uplifting and heroic tune of Batman's main theme, which is far more inspiring and pulse-raising than Danny Elfman's moody, atmospheric, and mystical pieces in Tim Burton's films. There is interesting inspiration between Goldenthal's score, as the composer explained, quote, "I was trying to remember myself as like a little child playing with a little Batman toy. I was thinking, what are the children singing? They sing their own scores. If you look and watch kids play, they're composing their own music." Clearly, Schumacher's overall simplification through exaggeration technique was at play in this department as well, as the musical component was to be as informative, exciting, as bare bones as possible. Even so, Goldenthal's music, widely regarded as inferior to the much appreciated contribution of Elfman's, appears to dovetail perfectly with the heroic narrative, along with other classics such as John Williams' Superman theme or Alan Silvestri's The Avengers theme, from the source material of heroic scores by, as Matthew David Young demonstrates, developing variations on the military themes. Goldenthal's leitmotif, more uplifting and less eerie than the Batman theme by Elfman, constitutes another token of the Schumacher-driven shift towards the living comic book experience, where all requisite qualities were amplified to make those features a multisensory thrill. This interpretation of Joel Schumacher's Neon Night in the light of the aesthetic values he espoused underscores the paradigm of optical and compositional exaggeration, by means of which the depiction of Batman as the Dark Knight could be realigned to obtain a more luminous variation. As it is, Schumacher's involvement in the Batman franchise in 1995 marked a significant change with respect to Burton's earlier interpretation that produced the Noirmare Night. Instead of an expressionistic Christmas carol, the audience received a psychedelic explosion of light and dark contrasts, which honored the achievement of the previous films but also overcame their exceedingly monochromatic mood. As a result, Schumacher certainly succeeded in exploring the living comic book concept to the full, thus exposing an obvious truth about the main character that many refused to acknowledge. The truth of his comic book roots and largely unrestricted visual possibilities, which went far beyond the limited realistic approach. That particular director's version of a superhero film as a visual thriller directly drew on the 1960s camp night's colorful vividness, only to elaborate on it and brighten Batman lore with the omnipresent incandescence of the costumes, gadgets, and landscapes, as well as accomplish a neon-lit shift in filmmaking towards the celebration of artifice. Bearing this in mind, one can recall the final riddle of Batman Forever. I see without seeing. To me, darkness is as clear as daylight. What am I? Through which Schumacher describes the hybrid of darkness and daylight that he tried to achieve. However, this attempt to lighten Gotham City and its heroic inhabitants entailed a much more significant consequence of having the Neon Knight thus materialized. Once again, this should be attributed to a tendency originating with Schumacher, whereby one looks past the norm to envision a psychologically lightened Batman as well. In a conversation with John C. Tibbetts, the director admitted that the most iconic image from his first take on Batman, the spectacular bat signal within a question mark projected in the sky just before the climax of the movie, quote, questions Bruce Wayne and Batman's entire existence, and he poses for him a choice at the end of the movie. End quote. In line with Schumacher's intentions, that symbolic emblem may be read as both a symbolic diegetic nod towards Bruce Wayne's quandary of whether to accept or reject his dual personality, and a much more meta-textual question about what Batman really is or can be, or when Batman stops being Batman, and what makes the Batman icon truly forever.